Your lecturer is Dr. Jennifer Cunard Black. Dr. Cunard Black is a professor of English at St. Mary's College of Maryland, where she has taught since 2000. She received her PhD in 19th century British and American literature from The Ohio State University. Dr. Cunard Black is the co-editor of 3 literary collections, as well as a prolific literary critic and creative writer. She has received numerous teaching awards, was named a Fulbright Scholar, and is the recipient of a Maryland State Arts Council Individual Artist Award. Her anthology From Curlers to Chainsaws won a gold medal in the National 2016 Independent Publisher Book Awards contest.
In 1580, Michel de Montaigne published a 3-volume collection of writings that scholars agree are the world's first book of essays. He titled them Attempts. Other writers before Montaigne had turned to themselves as primary subject matter, but no one before him had thought the stuff of a person's everyday life was worthy of close literary attention. And Montaigne's frankness about his limitations and his ignorance was remarkable. In one essay, defending the ideas of a certain theologian, Montaigne summed up his arguments with the question, "What do I know?" This pretty much sums up his approach to essay writing as well. Montaigne's subjects range from the sublime to the mundane, from prayer and the force of the imagination to drunkenness and thumbs. His preferred structure is a series of digressions that allow him to follow the vagaries of his own thoughts. And Montaigne wrote these essays in vernacular French rather than formal Latin, so his voice is immediate and intimate, like a conversation between 2 friends bending elbows at a local bar. In the spirit of Montaigne, I'd like to begin this course by telling you something about myself and why I'm trying to answer his essential question, what do I know? I'm offering you stories embedded in vibrant and poignant essays from some of the world's finest writers. In doing so, we'll examine and master some of the most useful tools in the essay writer's toolbox. Each one of us has the capacity to write meaningful essays that tap into the heartbeat of humanity. And while I'll share some of my favorite published essays with you, and their many, many intriguing forms, I'll also draw from some of my own writing as well, from my published works to drafts from my own notebooks, some of which might evolve into formal essays over time, but for right now, are works in progress. In these lectures, you'll meet some of my colleagues, students, and family members, including my great-grandmother Minnie, who is held within the folds of a handwritten letter that serves as the inspiration for a lecture on epistolary essays. You'll also meet my maternal grandmother Peg, whose recipe for date-puffed rice balls launches our discussion of food essays, a delectable and dynamic form of essay writing. The essence of any food essay is a recipe itself, which is a form of storytelling all its own. To get at it, we'll dive into my Grandma Peg's 2-foot-long recipe box, which contains over 1,400 recipe cards, or 1,400 potential essays. And you'll meet my daughter Kate, who has been the subject of some of my own published essays. I'll also take you to my family home in Nebraska, which is where I first learned the essay writer's fraught lesson of balancing a nostalgic heart against a logical mind. Now, in terms of my vital statistics, I should tell you that I'm a professor of English at St. Mary's College of Maryland, a public liberal arts college next to the state's colonial capital of St. Mary's City. My master's degree is in fiction and essay writing from Iowa State University, where I studied under the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Jane Smiley. And my doctorate in 19th century British and American literature and women writers is from The Ohio State University. I'm also a former Fulbright scholar who taught creative writing and American literature in Slovenia, and I'm the author of 5 books, including a co-edited collection of The Literatures of Food, Books That Cook, The Making of a Literary Meal, and a second collection of essays called From Curlers to Chainsaws, Women and Their Machines. My mother and father both have PhDs in English and are now retired teachers of literature, specifically Shakespeare. And my sister, who also holds a PhD in English, is now a college president. So as you might imagine, my upbringing was a bit unusual, and yet that's why I'm here with you now. My love of words and of storytelling started early. So in this course, I'm going to introduce you to some of the greatest storytellers of all time, specifically those who have chosen to tell their stories through essays. We'll begin with Montaigne, who invented and popularized the essay as a literary genre. We'll also learn about many of his successors, including the 18th century British wits, Joseph Addison and Sir Richard Steele. And then on the other side of the Atlantic, a century later, the philosopher-poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote some of the first essays on nature and the environment. We'll also look at a few women writers who made the essay their own at the beginning of the 20th century, such as Virginia Woolf and Mary McCarthy. And we'll spend most of our time talking about the work of living essayists, such as Naomi Shihab Nye, Annie Dillard, Joan Didion, Dinty Moore, Barbara Kingsolver, David Sedaris, Michael Pollan, Jeanette Winterson, MFK Fisher, and Maya Angelou. I'll also introduce you to some experimental writers who are currently exploding and remaking the essay, such as Joy Castro, Ellen Malloy, Michael P. Branch, and Ta-Nehisi Coates. We'll also peek behind the curtain of the writing process. I'll give you examples of works in progress written by my own students, as well as a number of essays, both published and in draft form, that I've written myself. For I've been writing and reading essays for decades now, and I'd like to show you some of my own struggles and successes. Now, let me begin again, and I should probably start with a really basic question. What is an essay? Is an essay an argument, a recollection, or a writer's thoughts on a specific subject? Is an essay a blog post, a food review, or a piece of literary criticism? Is it some kind of erudite poetic prose, writing that's bound in leather and tucked on a bookshelf? Well, I would say that it's possible for an artful essay to be any of these, depending upon a writer's purpose. For essay is a word that originally meant an attempt or an experiment. And there are many ways to experiment with words to form essays. So an essay is an attempt at connecting your personal experience, ideas, and memories to people outside of yourself. An essay is as direct and palpable as a handshake, and yet to be effective, it's a form that requires careful preparation and delivery. The essay has something in common with one-act plays, lyric poems, short stories, and TV shows. These are genres that are meant to move and to provoke their audiences in a single reading or viewing. As Edgar Allan Poe wrote in an essay called The Philosophy of Composition, "If any literary work is too long to be read at one sitting, we must be content to dispense with the important effect derivable from unity of impression. For if 2 sittings be required, the affairs of the world interfere, and everything like totality is at once destroyed." I would say then that an essay is a totality. It is a whole world distilled. Montaigne's essays have come to define the basic principles of the modern essay, which is a true story told in accessible language by someone who has direct experience with the subject matter. An essay is also a story that creates its own form as it goes along. And so we owe a great debt to Montaigne for creating the form and voice of what has become the contemporary essay. But we also owe him a debt for defining the essay's central purpose. Montaigne believed that the individual represents the universal, and he continually sought to link his own particular life to wider human experience. As Montaigne himself once wrote, "Every man has within himself the entire human condition." This revelation underscores the idea that essayists must write not just for themselves, but for their readers. For the genre of the essay is perfectly adapted for delving into our central desires as human beings to try to understand who we are. And that central desire might explain the essay's appeal and its widespread popularity. After Montaigne, the popularity of what was at the time this newfangled genre jumped the channel with Francis Bacon writing his own collection in English, also called Attempts or Essays, in 1597. The English essay then came fully into its own about a century later, with the rise of the middle-class reading public who was eager to hear engaging stories about real people like themselves, or like the selves they hoped to be. At the beginning of the 18th century, Joseph Addison and Sir Richard Steele launched literary and society journals with a satiric bent called The Tatler and The Spectator that both celebrated and also critiqued their peers. Theirs was a ready-made, literate audience with disposable income, casting about for something clever to read. In a departure from Montaigne's self-reflection, Addison and Steele turned outward. They created narrative personas such as Mr. Spectator, who spectated on human flaws and foibles, and then tattled about them. Almost overnight, London society was chatting about the hottest essays in the Tatler or the Spectator while sipping a good, strong cuppa at one of the city's popular coffee houses. Addison and Steele aimed to delight and to surprise their readers, not to preach at them. But, that said, their essays did have an instructive purpose. They saw themselves as arbiters of their own culture, defining what was, and what was not, acceptable behavior. And without their innovation of turning the personal essay into a public one, it's actually not an exaggeration to say there never would have been a New Yorker or a Harper's Magazine or a London Review of Books. Ever since Addison and Steele developed Montaigne's private ponderings into a kind of public discourse, the essay has been a vital part of intellectual life around the world, from drawing rooms to schoolrooms, from clubs to assemblies, and of course, from coffee shops to tea houses. For an essay is a notoriously flexible and adaptable form, the words of essayist Philip Lopate. And yet, even the word form may be somewhat misleading, as the essay almost resists definition, allowing for all kinds of shapes and styles. Okay, so are we any closer to answering my question? What is an essay? Well, as I've mentioned, there are personal and public essays, but there are also essays that are argumentative, lyrical, epistolary, historic, and humorous. Some essays are built around themes such as travel, nature, and food. Others are experimental, including such adaptations as the micro-essay and the proem, which is a cross between poetry and prose. There are even forms that at first blush might not seem to be essays at all, like letters or commencement addresses and blog posts. And then to complicate things even further, essays are written in all kinds of tones and approaches, from critical and playful to expository and exploratory. For instance, there is a world of difference between a New Yorker essay by Adam Gopnik on a mutant pastry called the cronut and a letter by Abigail Adams to her husband John, telling him to remember the ladies while he was helping to make new laws in the wake of declaring America's independence. And yet, all of these examples utilize the same basic features. They are all true stories, told in smart words, by the very people who lived or witnessed the story. In the introduction to his anthology, The Art of the Personal Essay, Philip Lopate offers this taxonomy. He explains that there are formal essays and then there are informal ones. And while it's possible to trace the rhetorical components of formal essays back to Aristotle, which is a point that I will return to later, what we think of as a formal essay today is largely the kind that students start to write in grade school when teachers ask them to write a theme. Now, you might remember that in the movie A Christmas Story, Ralphie Parker has to write his theme on what he wants for Christmas, which is, of course, a Red Ryder BB gun. Even today, more than 50 years later, school kids are still assigned descriptive, comparison-contrast, and expository essays to demonstrate their knowledge of a subject matter, as well as their writing abilities. Think what I did on my summer vacation. Then, in middle school, writers go on to develop such basic themes into persuasive essays, ones that move students from the relatively limited circle of their own experiences into the school library and the broader experiences that are contained on its shelves. Persuasive essays have the intent of teaching young minds how to write a thesis statement, how to learn principles of organization, and how to practice, use, and cite secondary sources. And this essay form, which is sometimes called the test essay or the 5-paragraph essay, is now the gold standard for taking timed exams, writing speeches, or writing research papers in college-level classes. In the hands of national testing companies and public school administrators, what Lopate calls the formal essay, which was once brilliant and groundbreaking, has increasingly become boring, repetitive, and cliched. So in this lecture series, we are not going to explore the 5-paragraph essay. I'm interested in talking with you about the art of the essay, not cookie-cutter pieces that leave readers yawning, wondering what they're going to have for dinner. So, back to Lopate and his distinctions between formal and informal essays. If the modern-day stereotype of the formal essay is the 5-paragraph one, the stereotype of the informal essay is that it's always personal. And informal essays are plagued by cliched conventions as well, particularly in college entrance essays or blog posts. To give you a brief example of what I mean, the Huffington Post published an article on the 7 most cliched subjects for college essays, including the sports highlight reel, writing about a role model, detailing the heart-wrenching specifics of a mission trip, or recounting a national disaster. In recent years, too, blog posts have become another prevalent kind of informal essay in which people blurt out their moment-by-moment thoughts and feelings. Now, sometimes blog posts are worthy of our attention. Their humor or their tenderness make them worthy of turning them into books, such as Julie and Julia or Post Secret. That said, this social media space is mostly occupied by trivia, such as top 10 lists, complaints about how busy a writer is, or even blogging about blogging. So while differences between Lopate's formal and informal essays are meaningful for literary critics who want to distinguish between the writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson and those of Sarah Vowell, these labels are probably less useful for considering what the essay is writ large, in part because the formal and informal essay have now been reduced to cultural cliches. And even Lopate admits as much when he writes that the distinction between the formal and informal essay can be overdone, and most great essayists have crossed the line frequently. So I bet you're starting to wonder whether I'll actually ever answer the question, what is an essay? Fair point. If an essay can't be defined easily as either formal or informal, are there other possibilities for what makes an essay an essay? Yes, there are. We might think of essays as containers for human memory, and these days many writers are trying their hands at memoir. Thanks to authors such as Patricia Hampel and Bill Rohrbach, memoir has become something more than those ghost-written tell-alls by rockers and starlets. And Rohrbach's definition of memoir is, I think, quite useful for essayists. He calls memoir A true story, a work of narrative built directly from the memory of its writer, with an added element of creative research. Memoir arises in and exists only because of the first-person singular, the I remembering. In turn, Patricia Hample's ideas about why people love memoir is also helpful. We do not, after all, simply have experience. We are entrusted with it. We must do something, make something with it. These ideas should resonate with essayists. For what matters most is how we writers witness the world around us and then remember what we saw and heard and felt by putting those memories into words. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. So is an essay primarily a vehicle for recording your own memories? Well, yes and no. The definition of memoir is too limited. An essay is not a synonym for memoir because memoir is always about the past, the writer's recollections. And while there's no question that an artful essay can be every bit as subjective and intimate as a memoir, an essay doesn't have to be about the writer's own life, even though that's often a really good place to start. So it's more accurate to say that memoir is a type of essay. Okay, so here we are, in a sense back where we began, still wondering, how do we define an essay? Now, I suppose I could give you a vague definition or a simile in lieu of an answer. I could echo Philip Lopate's claim that the essay is flexible and adaptable, and call it protean or malleable, or maybe a form as pliant as taffy, or one that's as all-encompassing as the sky. But there are specific characteristics by which we recognize essays as essays, and not as poetry or research papers, recipes, or mystery novels. Remember that the etymology for the word essay means an attempt or an experiment. We essay writers are adventurers and trailblazers. We are able to engage a kind of originality that's harder to find in the conventions of fiction or poetry or drama. For fiction must have its plot and characters. Poetry must have its lines, stanzas, and rhythms. And drama must have its dialogue and scenes. But the essay has no fixed parameters apart from including a first-person narrator who is intent on telling the truth. An essay's form and style is entirely dependent upon your purpose and your audience. You get to create a new form and adopt a new style with each and every essay that you write. Even more liberating, we essay writers get to be thieves without any concern for consequences. An essayist is expected to steal, to adopt, and to adapt aspects of all other forms of writing. So we essay writers then get to collage these elements together in order to build a new whole. Essayists draw on the facts of history and science, the musings of philosophy and theology, the melodies and harmonies of music, and even on the visual elements of film or cartoons. And then, by applying the techniques of poets, fiction writers, and dramatists, we document imaginative, but not imaginary, encounters with the real. So let me return to Aristotle. And in turning to Aristotle, I'll finally give you my own answer to the question, what is an essay? If your hope is to write essays that curl the toes and circle the heart, I believe the following 5 elements are essential. First, an essay must have ethos. Aristotle, in his treatise called The Rhetoric, discusses this term at length. Ethos means the moral character of the writer, and it is of great importance as a component of successful argumentation. Ethos is the first of what Aristotle calls 3 artistic proofs, or modes of persuasion. The other 2 are pathos, or emotional appeals, and logos, which is how a writer proves a truth through rational argumentation. These 3 artistic proofs of ethos, pathos, and logos are available to any writer who hopes to convince and to compel her audience on any topic. Yet an essay writer's ethos also has to move beyond a captivating style or an enthralling subject. In order to be trustworthy, the essayist must also be reliable, both honest and true. Second, in addition to building ethos, an essayist must work to represent a larger, more universal truth to her audience. Once ethos is established, then an essay must speak beyond the petty concerns or obsessions of the essayist herself. Philip Lopate says the essay has embedded within it a democratic bent in the value it places on experience rather than status distinctions. Successful essays engage the wider world and those who inhabit it, namely your readers. Remember Montaigne's maxim that every man has within himself the entire human condition. Third, an essay must take into account what my students and I call the so what. If you jot down notes about a fickle lover or how much your sister irritates you, or if your Uncle Joe sits down to type out the anecdotes he's told every year at the annual family picnic, these are instances of personal storytelling that fail to consider the wider world. So any essayist must ask, so what? What is the purpose, the point of my essay? What is my central claim, argument, or conception? We must remember that we write for the common reader, that figure Virginia Woolf imagined over a century ago. We write for the woman on the bus, the man on the train, not for academics or even other essayists. This is the common reader who is intelligent, curious, and hungry for meaning. And if our writing can't speak to this common reader, then we are not speaking to people. We're just talking to ourselves, standing in a crowd while taking a selfie. Fourth, while all essays adopt a structure of some kind, there is no formula to follow. Now here I'm going to quote Bill Rohrbach once again. "Abandon the outline, all ye who enter here. Discovery is the thing." An essay is a kind of mental walkabout. It's Virginia Woolf strolling around London in her essay, Street Haunting. It's Wendell Berry's journey from the city to the country in his essay, An Entrance to the Woods. When reading an essay, we meander inside someone else's head. We look out through his or her eyes, and within that mind, we find a cabinet of curiosities, an eclectic and well-stocked collection of fascinating objects, scenes, places, people, and ideas. And fifth and finally, an essayist must tell the truth. As the well-known writer Lee Gutkin says, "You can't make this stuff up." Because a writer needs to convince her audience that she's credible, that she has wisdom, and that she's reliable. And so we've actually circled back around to my first point, which is that an essay writer's ethos is the clout of character that makes her claims both powerful and credible. It's important to understand that ethos comes from the writer herself. It's innate, an essential part of who she is. Her character is the proof of her claims, her thoughts, and her memories. And because ethos is a proof that comes directly from the writer herself, as I mentioned, Aristotle calls it an artistic proof. By artistic proof, Aristotle means that the integrity of the writing stems directly from the author, rather than from data, interviews, statistics, or other non-artistic proofs. Unlike other kinds of writing that adopt a distant and supposedly objective third-person point of view, essays are always subjective, and they're almost always written in the first person. Put simply then, an essay's ethos is the credibility that comes out of the writer's self-knowledge and self-presentation. In contrast with the lunatic, the lover, the novelist, and the poet, who all engage imagination, in Shakespeare's famous words, to body forth the forms of things unknown, essayists turn to actual lived experience in order to consider abstract ideas. Yet an essayist cannot tell a reader about just her own life. Instead, an essay writer must allow that reader to re-experience something both vital and true about the human. And so abstract ideas and themes must be grounded in concrete facts. And yet, these facts must then be synthesized with intelligence, emotion, and reflection that speak both to the hearts and heads of readers. For essays demand to be written and read by the whole person. In my own essay writing classes, I often ask my students to keep commonplace books, and I want to suggest that you consider keeping one too. When Montaigne was busily writing his essays, commonplace books became quite popular throughout Europe as a way to record things for future use. If you want a definition, Harvard Library's website defines them as a collection of significant or well-known passages that have been copied and organized in some way in order to serve as a memory aid or reference to the compiler. For your purposes, a contemporary commonplace book might be a notebook or a sketchpad or a tablet. What matters is that it be big enough to weave together a tapestry of quotations, ideas, and notes on a single page. And then you should use this book as a way to pay close attention to everything around you. So much of our lives are determined by routines, the things we always do and the places we always go. The commonplace book is where you can either deliberately break out of your routines, or you can write them down to examine them and see them through new eyes. Notice the people, the places, and the things all around you, and then write down details about them that are odd or striking or beautiful or unnerving. When you're reading someone else's work, jot down quotations or whole passages that inspire or agitate you. And then for organization, you can design pages within your book around certain themes that you find interesting. As you develop your commonplace book around these themes, you'll discover your own habits of mind, what moves you, irritates you, and fascinates you. So here's another definition of the word essay. It's obscure, but it's still appropriate, I think. In addition to meaning an attempt many centuries ago, an essay also meant a rough copy or a first draft. So as you start writing your own essays, as you pay attention to the world around you through your commonplace book, and try to tell true stories based on your own experiences, memories, and thoughts, I urge you to go where your path leads and not to worry too much about how rough your writing is. Just follow your words and keep asking yourself, after Montaigne, what do I know? The result will be a one-of-a-kind writing that is your own essay, your own attempt, your own first draft. And I would say that this piece will become the best definition, really, of what an essay is and what it can be.